Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our Vendor Onboarding, How to Do It Correctly webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you're not familiar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide those widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout each session. We will be answering some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to answer all polling questions that will appear on your screen during today's presentation. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the live session that will need to be completed in order to receive the CPE credit. With us today, we have Greg Cameron, VinMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Advisory. He will talk about finding new vendors and their subsequent onboarding, including planning, risk assessment, due diligence, contracting, and more. You'll see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our third-party risk management lifecycle toolkit, our What to Include in Your Critical Vendor Contracts ebook, our Vendor Vetting 19 Things You Should Be Doing ebook, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all within the Related Content widget. With all that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Greg. Greg, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Looking at the agenda for today, we're going to break down onboarding into sequential steps. And it's not just individual steps, it's how they interrelate with each other and how it's essentially building blocks to go from one segment or stage of the life cycle to the next. We'll start with planning, looking at selecting vendors and some considerations for that stage. We'll look at risk assessment, those key objectives, making sure you don't lose sight of what's the primary reason you're going through the risk assessment, which of course leads us into due diligence. We'll talk about some challenges there. We've of course previously presented webinars covering deep dives into due diligence, so we'd like to focus here on preparing for contracting in particular. Of course, looking at targeted risk-based due diligence, but also considering the challenges as you go through that process. And last, we'll look at risk mitigation through contracting, which should follow due diligence, key clauses, and some risk-based input examples there. And we'll wrap up this onboarding webinar with key takeaways and summarize these objectives of the life cycle stage. So what is onboarding? It's the foundational aspect and the starting point of any potential vendor relationship. You're bringing in a new relationship, a new product, service into your organization. So there are risks there that are associated with this. There are costs. There's an understanding of the business requirement and the needs, and the benefit and the intended use of this relationship, this product service. So it's important to have all of your bases covered here. Key objective-wise, you're validating the need to identify all the different vendor options that are out there in the industry. You're starting to qualify and quantify risk. You're looking at controls that the vendor has in place, making you feel good about this future relationship. You're also looking at controls that you can put in place yourself as the customer. Ultimately, onboarding sets you up for success with this relationship and allows you to make a final decision of the vendor. Well, as we see here, onboarding sits in the front of the life cycle. You're only going to go through this area of the life cycle once. The work you do here will allow you to get to the ongoing area. the so-called business as usual state in using this product or service. There's recurring activities, and you'll be in this stage the longest. But before you can get there to ongoing, you're walking up the steps. You're preparing for this relationship through the onboarding activities we're discussing today. So let's take a moment to break down these life cycle stages. First and foremost, planning and risk assessment. You're going to be identifying whether or not this vendor and product and service are even in scope of risk assessment and due diligence. Not all vendors are. Not all products and services are in scope. So refer to your policy there and review if these are exceptions to that. You're going to be conducting inherent risk assessment for those that are in scope. And this is very much foundational to the rest of the life cycle. So we'll talk about specific categories to evaluate there. And that, of course, informs your due diligence, as previously mentioned. This is your next step. Which amount of due diligence and which areas you're actually reviewing, all driven by the upstream risk assessment. And finally, contracting and developing this process that allows you to protect yourself, ensures that there's details of what's being delivered, the level of service that you're expecting, and sets you up for all the expectations for the entire relationship, right through termination. So jumping into planning, the very first step in the entire third-party risk management lifecycle, this starts with identifying the needs of the business. This is their case, their justification for the product and service, and the eventual cost, the potential risks that could be experienced with this relationship. There's identifying an owner, because it's important to have a single point of contact and who's going to make sure that it goes from planning into the subsequent risk cycle activities. Could be the requester or the vendor owner who's accountable for this. You're also going to be looking at overall vendor options. Who's in the business? Who provides similar products and services that can meet the business needs? You might be doing some initial public vetting that we'll talk about. Public because it's separate from interacting with the vendor, so much more public-facing. You're going to be identifying exit strategies, and we'll talk about that and how that's done and when that's done appropriately. And lastly, you're getting ready for risk assessment. You might involve importing or uploading to the software that you might be using, making sure you have the right information in place so that you can be objective and perform an accurate risk assessment. So it's important here, in terms of what's planned, to define product and service business requirements. What are the internal customers? What is the product and service that they're asking for? What is the potential problem that's being solved here? This is the baseline information that allows you to engage the right teams. You're going to likely have this request be sent to sourcing or procurement, departmental leads. The request might go to third-party risk management. They might be the recipients of the business case and requests. This is going to vary by organization, but it's important to understand where this should be sent. Other stakeholders might be IT. If the engagement could require IT infrastructure and integration, there might be discussions and approvals there. Certainly legal has to be aware, especially if this is a newer product and service that's never been contracted with your organization before. Now is the time to start to engage them. So again, this is the early definition and important baseline information as it relates to the business request and their key requirements. Well, also in planning, we have the RFP process, request for proposal. Very much a formal interaction with vendors. So this typically will follow the initial business request, and it's very important to know who we're doing RFPs for. where they might be optional, where they're mandatory. This could be driven by spend cost. This could be driven by the type of product or service. This could be driven by maybe sensitivity of data. Your IT team might require RFPs for all customer data-related vendors, for example. That should be defined in your policy, so make sure it's clear that all vendor owners, requesters, understand when you should take advantage and utilize this process. Like we said, it's formal, referenced by both sides. It allows you to tell your vendor what you're looking for, what your expectations are, how you're integrating into the business, and allow them to tell you things like cost and the timing and mechanisms for integration and how they operate. You're typically going to send more than one out, so you're able to compare vendors and compare all the different RFP data points, especially as it relates to cost analysis, and really open up that bidding environment. Well, here's a list to consider as it relates to vendor vetting or more public-facing screening. Office of Foreign Agents, politically exposed people. These are checks that you can consider, in addition to vendor complaints and any research findings. Of course, customer reviews, negative news searches. Google's a fantastic tool there for that. Don't be shy to do some additional homework, as this could actually truncate the list of potential options before you get too far and spend your valuable time and effort with risk assessment. Also, a great step to consider is, if publicly traded, you can look at statistics and financials. So I'll point to Yahoo Finance as an example of that. There's even press releases there and news. So last, if you have a relationship with D&B, that could also potentially, provide report for credit worthiness. So this is a good starting point for you in terms of vetting and screening. All right, so let's talk about exit strategies. This is something you should be thinking about now within planning. It's a consideration for disruption, a consideration for the product and service going away permanently. The cause is not as important as the impact, and understanding what you have as a game plan and as an option if this situation happens. There are some strategies to consider, like replacing vendors. Generally, this is the primary one to think about, and whether or not there is an alternate vendor to utilize. You could think about bringing the activity in-house, or what some organizations call absorption. And you could consider the potential for discontinuing the activity and the reliance. Of course, thinking about combinations of these. For example, there might be a piece or a segment that you can absorb, while there might be a piece that could be replaced by another vendor. So replacements and these combinations aren't always like for like. It might be a partial replacement. Again, it's not a plan with procedures. It's an understanding of what potential options there are. Now is the time to do this through planning. And while criticality criteria and that evaluation to follow may be the driver and the ultimate demand for this exit strategy to be further developed, you can consider it now and build this into the conversation. So as you move forward, you have a starting point and you understand what options there are to expand upon if and when needed.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, does your organization use RFPs in combination with vendor due diligence? Yes, we use RFPs in combination with vendor due diligence. No, RFPs are used as part of a separate process. we don't use RFPs or you're not sure. And Greg, it looks like we have some time to answer one of the questions that has come in so far from the audience. And that question is, should I be sending an RFP for every vendor or just critical and high-risk vendors?
Sure. Well, request for proposal, very much a formal process, as we know, very prescriptive, so it's not often done for all vendors. Commonly, it's tied to expected critical vendors, but also can be utilized for high-spend products and services. Remember that you may not know the risk rating at the time of RFP. So do look at what criteria makes sense for your organization to apply it consistently. This does vary by organization. My overall recommendation would be to take advantage of this process. It's certainly a great method to compare vendors and open up that bidding environment for yourselves as a customer, but you won't be applying it for all vendors. Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks, everyone, for answering that poll question. Here are those results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Also, before we move on, in the Related Content widget, you will find our Third-Party Risk Management Lifecycle Toolkit. This toolkit covers in more detail where onboarding fits within the lifecycle with an ebook, infographic, PowerPoint template, and printable one-page PDF. With that, Greg, back to you.
Well, with planning taken care of, and with an understanding of what your vendor options are, or what vendors are in scope, risk assessment now allows you to evaluate the relationship. And inherent risk is exactly that. It's just looking at who the vendor is, what they're providing to you all, how you're going to use it in your business. It's separate and does not account for any controls or risk mitigants and reducers. It's simply raw risk, qualifies and quantifies specific categories of risk. Now, this is different from criticality assessment, which is typically at the vendor level. Inherent risk is at the product or service level. Both very much objective and should be performed consistently, but typically criticality is shorter. It's a yes or no criteria. Well, here it is in writing. These are good examples of criticality determination. Would a sudden loss of this vendor cause disruption to your organization? Would a disruption impact your customers? If the time for the vendor to recover operations exceeds 24 hours, would there be a negative impact to your organization? If any of these are yes, it could be considered critical. This is just a baseline. You might have more. You might, for example, bring reputational themes in these questions, or increased regular scrutiny and that concept into this criticality determination. It very much varies by organization, but you should be doing this consistently and applying them across all of your vendors using the same criteria. If you're not familiar with your own criteria, you should reference your third-party risk management or vendor management policy, see what's defined there. But consider these on the screen options and something to compare to, and look for improvement opportunities for what you have currently for your own criticality criteria. Well, we wanted to reiterate some really important baseline concepts here about risk assessment. Again, by definition, inherent risk considers your risks to the product or service based on the relationship. It doesn't consider or bring in any measure of risk control, risk mitigants, risk reducers. So this is very much a raw risk calculation. It should be formal. It should be applied consistently. It is not subjective, and very much calculated in order for it to be successful. Now, we'll talk about specific categories that allows you to do this. So a well-developed risk assessment is going to have questions, multiple questions, against targeted categories. You can see most of these categories on the screen. You'll likely be familiar with several of them. Obviously, cyber is a hot topic. Business continuity, operational is widely utilized. But you should consider all categories, outside of those 3 or 4. So, for example, to what extent might there be compliance or regulatory risks with the use of this product or service? Maybe concentration risks if there's an oversubscription or widely use of this one particular product and service in your organization. You could think about reputational impacts and customer impacts if there's an interruption to the product or service, and country risks, so vendors operating out of country and where that might trigger and identify unique regulation and data privacy concerns. So these are risks outside of what's typical to take a look at. These are likely defined in your policy, so it is worth doing a comparison, this list, to what you're currently using, see if there's any room for discussion around these categories there. And certainly there's reference to these at the regulatory body level, so cross-reference that and ensure you're compliant with what risks are targeted depending on your industry sector. Well, before we move on to due diligence, I want to talk about the key objectives of risk assessment and making sure we never lose sight of this. It's arguable that inherent risk assessment is the most important area of the entire third-party risk management lifecycle because it informs everything that comes after it in terms of what activity you're doing and how frequently you're doing it. So ensuring that you're qualifying the categorical risks, in other words, what risks are present, and quantifying them. So to what extent are there those business continuity or cyber risks? This allows you to then trigger the appropriate due diligence and making sure it's risk-based and prescriptive. Obviously, not doing enough due diligence is definitely a problem. And risk assessment informs you to what amount of due diligence you should be applying. It's also going to act as an input to contractual nuances, which we'll talk about. But again, this foundation sets up a cadence for recurring activities. So it's such a key task to make sure it's robust and thoughtful. This brings us to due diligence. We find ourselves here having followed planning and risk assessment. So this is the step that helps you determine if the vendor has the right controls in place. Can they deliver their contractual obligations to you? Do you feel comfortable moving forward into a contract with them? And it also informs you of whether or not you need to take your own steps internally. In addition to what the vendor's doing to reduce risk, are there any other controls that you might want to consider internally? This should give you an educated decision at a high level if it's a go or no-go. It's valuable and a great way to compare multiple vendors. This might be the differentiator. And certainly it sets the stage for the relationship. You're letting the vendor know that you're following best practices. It's important to you, and you're likely going to revisit this on a regular basis. So very sound business strategy, certainly tied to regulatory requirements, so reference that based on the industry you're in. And as we move forward in these slides, we'll go deeper into some specific details and objectives. Here's a starting point for collection for every vendor, regardless of type or risk. Similar to RFP, this process requires the vendor themselves. This is not something you can do internally like you can risk assessment. So it's thinking about how they're incorporated, where they're incorporated, where they operate out of, their legal entity structure, doing business as, also known as. This is a starting point for you to capture the information that only the vendor can supply themselves. You should make sure that this is a checklist. Make sure that this is something you're asking consistently. Typically, in our experience, it's the vendor requester or vendor owner that's accountable to ask and capture this information. And then obviously this feeds into the rest and remaining of your due diligence effort to come. Here we have control-based evidence considerations. This is where you might send a questionnaire, whether that's a custom questionnaire or one that's been prepared. We personally like the SIG by shared assessments. This allows the vendor to answer very targeted questions about what they're doing to ensure contractual obligations are met, what they're doing to reduce risk, and what they have for controls in place. In addition to that, you might be requesting governance documentation and other evidence that validates the answers that have been provided by the vendor. So in addition to policies and program and standard governance documentations, there might also be testing evidence. There might be audited financial statements or other third-party reports. We like SOC 2s, which provide a lot of information. Certainly there's some variation depending on what's been triggered there. But overall, this list you can consider for all vendors, in addition to that initial vetting information. So this is now starting to get into control evidence for your review. Now we can start to talk about due diligence that's really based on risk. What's been triggered, shown as elevated through risk assessment? That might be business continuity and or disaster recovery and overall availability. As we know, we're still in a COVID period. So to what extent is pandemic relevant, remote working, or keywords are mass absenteeism, staff availability, and the testing of those programs? That's all very much risk-based. That could be identified and triggered through your risk assessment. You're going to be asking for due diligence evidence based on those qualified risks. Could also be additional regulatory findings or enforcement actions, litigations, and ongoing judgments. There could be environmental, social governance specific triggers here. Certainly subcontractors, really important. This is your vendor's vendors. It's not just important to know who they are, but what your third party is doing for their own third-party risk management program. So if that risk has been identified, if subcontractors, fourth parties are identified, you want to know what your vendor's doing in terms of controls around that for their organization. We should mention subject matter experts, or SMEs, and their role in due diligence. These are going to be additional stakeholders that allow you to perform due diligence effectively. There could be unique infrastructure documents, IT data center documents. Certainly business continuity and pandemic are very unique. So with those examples, not all vendor managers are in a position to review unique evidence and really understand what controls are effective and what might be missing from your vendor's programs. You should identify these SMEs in advance. They should have significant experience across their areas or domains that might have been triggered by risk assessment. Certainly this could be internal SMEs, but also think about external opportunities and leverage outsourced due diligence if and when needed. Well, like any area of the third-party risk management lifecycle, there might be challenges that you face. Certainly with due diligence in this interaction with the vendor, that's where the potential challenges lie. Some vendors might not be willing to participate to the extent that you'd like. They might not be sharing the files that you're requesting. or you might not see what you'd like to see in the files, and the controls might not be living up to the expectations that your subject matter experts want them to live up to. It's important to know how you're going to handle these challenges. Now, for what I would recommend, being flexible is ideal in terms of how you accomplish your due diligence. The goal should always be met. You want to perform the review of their controls, but it might not always be done the same way. There might be some variation. So you might have to have some flexibility, like conducting a site visit. You might have to have a virtual meeting where your subject matter experts can talk to theirs. You might have to get a redacted file. Yes, we would prefer non-redacted plans and policies, but they might be more willing to provide partial or wholly redacted files. They might not show you all of the testing results. So think about your own minimum requirements. What is your own preference? What still allows you to accomplish your objective while still providing some flexibility in the event that you run into some of these challenges?
Our second poll question of the day is, who owns the due diligence vetting process in your organization? Third-party risk management, legal or compliance, sourcing, procurement, lines of business or product owners. The responsibilities are shared between departments, not sure, or other. And Greg, I think we could answer another question. And that question is, who should be in charge of vendor vetting and vendor onboarding?
Well, when I think in charge, I think of ultimate accountability. So not necessarily the stakeholders performing the vetting and speaking directly to vendors, but those making sure that it is done, that it's done consistently, and that it's done as defined and outlined in governance materials like third-party risk management policy. So my recommendation would be to look at the third-party risk management team in terms of being in charge of vendor vetting, if that's possible, but this varies by organization, right? Not every company has a central third-party risk management team. So most commonly, the third-party risk management team, but certainly can be procurement, sourcing, or others beyond those. Ultimately, it should be defined in the policy in order to allow for tracking of compliance and for what's defined there. Should be very clear point of contact, either a department or a single person that's governing it. They're in charge and they have that ultimate accountability and ownership in ensuring vetting gets performed consistently and as outlined. Thanks.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. I'd like to quickly direct your attention to the related content widget, where you will find our Vendor Vetting 19 Things You Should Be Doing ebook available for download. This ebook provides a list of items you should be considering on all your vendors. Okay, Greg, let's continue with the presentation.
So we made it to contracting, the last stage in onboarding. We know risk assessment feeds into due diligence. Well, due diligence very much feeds into contracting as well, because you're going to be informed as to the potential add-ons to include. We'll dive into, over the next few slides, additional opportunities and clauses there. But at a high level, understand that this is the formal written legal obligations between yourself and your vendor that you're going into business with. Ideally, contracts are originated from your own organization, or what you might say on your own paper. And certainly your own legal counsel, whether that's inside or outside counsel, should be engaged to support this process. So they have the expertise and they are supporting this risk management step consistently. Again, we'll talk about specific clauses in the forthcoming slides, but Remember that its contractual standards follow risk assessment and due diligence and are informed by that as for things like service level agreements and specific metrics there and notification periods and other best practices. This can all be identified and documented formally through contracts. Why is contract management important? Well, as we know, it's legal binding business relationship. It also increases visibility to the relationship. For example, what the cost is, what the risks are. And this is important to be transparent beyond the business that knows this, the ultimate internal users or customers of this service. It establishes expectations for all parties. It's not just the third party's commitment, it's your own involvement, what you're going to request of them on a regular basis, or what's required of you and your role through termination at the end of the contract. So consider this through business as usual, the overall use over a long period of time, but also through termination and closing out the relationship. Contracting helps you avoid missing significant dates and helps to identify potential cost savings via issues management and strong negotiated renewal processes. So let's talk about the contract management as an end-to-end process. Overall, this is a process to draft, to review, to allow your legal stakeholders and the business to approve and finally and formally sign off or execute. You're having both sides agree to move forward with the contract in place. You do want to build in essential controls, but not all contracts are the same. Yes, there's going to be those baseline expectations like your customer right to audit, which is so important. But you want to build in and incorporate the nuances that come out of due diligence. These might be vendor product service specific. They might be risk driven. So you want to make sure this process allows you to incorporate those and it's not a one size fits all process. Certainly service level agreements that we'll talk a little bit more about here allow your vendor owners to hold the vendor accountable to what they're expecting. And ultimately, as you move forward, having this inventory of contracts is best practice because we want to make sure anyone that needs to review it should have access to it. Again, example being vendor owners understanding what the service level is and being able to hold the vendor accountable and compliant to those expectations. Well, here are some major elements that should be included for all vendor contracts. So this, beyond the scope of service and expectations and costs, this is where you're detailing things like performance standards, key performance indicators, service level agreements. We already talked about your rights to audit as a customer, which is so important for you to continue to be able to do due diligence in the future. We'll also see termination provisions. So important there to understand who's doing what. When are they returning equipment to you as a customer? What are they responsible for? Are you asking for a certificate of data destruction? We'll also see complaint process here and the use of subcontractors. So if they're changing their subcontractors, your fourth parties, you can be made aware of this. So great starting point for your legal team, legal counsel, whether internal or external, to start to consider and measure against what's currently in place in your process. What is an SLA? Well, service level agreement is formal, documented, clearly established expectations between two parties. It's how that service is going to be met and measured. And this allows your vendor managers on a regular basis, typically prescribed by risk rating, but they will look at this and evaluate to ensure they're getting what they paid for. So contractually, you should be determining and stating exactly what you're expecting and what it is you're paying for. There's some examples here. Service availability is one in terms of uptime. Could be business metrics in terms of what's being delivered or how frequently, the performance and quality there, or volume, for example. There could also be technical metrics. Think about service level agreements, really regardless of product and service, very prescriptive and detailed as to what you're expecting. The last note about service level agreements is how to write them effectively via some key components. You want to make sure that these are documented formally, it's comprehensive. Certainly there's expectations, the goals generally, but let's get a little bit more specific. There should be prescriptive metrics and responsibilities for all parties. Who's doing what? The timing or frequency of the activities. When is this done? There are activities at the end of the quarter. It might be a deliverable that's on a daily basis. There should also be clear escalation and dispute processes. What happens if SLAs are not being met? Who should your vendor manager get in contact with? What is the response commitment for you and the vendor to resolve the dispute, or to jump on a call and triage and or post-mortem and understand what's going on? So making sure everything's clear and defined will empower your vendor owner or service requester within your business to monitor effectively. The more information, the more components documented here, the better. The next few slides, we want to talk about incorporating contract provisions based on risk. We talked about the concept earlier, but taking a particular look now at examples of cyber information and security confidentiality contract provisions and clauses. You may be using business resumption, availability contingency planning clauses, or maybe it's the termination aspect. These are terms and conditions that are going to vary based on product and service, based on the relationship, the risks that's been identified in the overall complexity. So for cybersecurity, info security, specific contract clauses and provisions, you might be detailing accessibility to the vendor's policies and procedures. How often are you going to execute or take advantage of your customer right to audit? And what are the expectations that your vendors are going to be held to therein? What are you asking for on a regular basis? There might be specific data protection agreement or their own testing versus independent testing detailing. You might require a third party to come in and do penetration testing coming out of a poor previous penetration test that you found in due diligence. You might detail the frequency and the scope and the depth and the breadth of all these tests. It can all be contractually set up for them to be obligated to. Cyber resiliency, there's disclosure of fourth parties, not just the initial list, but as you move forward with this vendor, a notice of any change. And does that change include access to data, yours or your customers? So that can be included as well. So think about these additional provisions that partner and are added. This is respect to cyber and InfoSec following a review of those particular controls that the vendor might have in place. Here we have example provisions for business continuity, disaster recovery, or the availability of the product and service. These might require vendor additional testing requirements, specific frequency, availability of the test results themselves. This is where you might document specific recovery times. What is the business need for recovery and resumption of service? Might document backup responsibilities or how managed third parties are handled, especially for those that provide availability and business continuity aspects to the vendor themselves. Could be disruption notification periods. For example, if there is a disruption or some sort of an event, when should they notify you as a customer and what method? And the last example of risk-based provisions might be for termination. Some of these examples are product and service-based, but you also want to be sure you have any nuanced termination procedures based on risk and specific to what's been identified through your due diligence effort. Return of equipment, or maybe a mutually acceptable method of data destruction, whether that's certified or otherwise. Think about disconnection of integrated technologies and knowing what they have in place for controls versus what you're holding them accountable to through termination is going to vary. Issues management as well, in terms of how that will be handled if something goes awry. For example, if they haven't returned the equipment that you've asked them to return within, let's say, 30 days. So there are clearly unique risk-based clauses here through termination. But think about the entire termination process. Don't assume that it's the same for every vendor, and allow your due diligence process to inform these contractual provisions. We just want to touch on the relationship of inherent risk to residual. We know that some organizations consider residual risk, but not everyone calculates it down to a number or a measured metric. The concept that everyone should understand is that beyond the baseline relationship, that inherent risk that we talked about earlier, as you go through due diligence and as you go through developing thoughtful contracts, both of them both either mitigate risk or identify what risks remain from that initial inherent risk. So residual is typically less than or equal to inherent. Again, it follows everything relating to control identification and risk mitigation. So this is a great visual here, funneling inherent risk down to a more reduced residual risk, having understood what controls are in place, either yourself or on the vendor side.
Our next question is, does your organization have your own contract templates and baseline clauses in place to use for new vendors? Yes, we have templates based on product type. We have one vendor contract to use. We sometimes use vendor contracts and not our own, or not sure. Greg, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience. And that next question is, what if the vendor will not provide information asked for in the vendor process?
Yeah, of course. I would say it's problematic, but not uncommon. Should be prepared for this scenario. In the context of today, we're talking about new vendors. So we don't have the clause in place contractually to take advantage of here, the so-called customer right to audit, because it's a new relationship in absence of a contract. So it's important to open up dialogue with this new vendor, make them understand that this is something you take very seriously. You're performing best practices in terms of vetting and due diligence. Let them know that this is a must-have here. It's not optional. And especially if there's alternate vendor products and services to consider, let them know that they might not win your business, right? This is a toll gate that they have to pass, and it's a problem. But in addition to that, think about alternatives in terms of what you're asking for. Maybe they're answering a questionnaire, but they don't want to give you a policy. Well, maybe in lieu of a policy, they can jump on a phone call and you can connect your subject matter experts to discuss it and review it. Or they can provide a redacted version rather than the original. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an automatic stopping point. Open up dialogue. Let them know that there is some flexibility in how it's accomplished, but that you're very inflexible in terms of it not being performed at all. So that would be the recommendation there. Thank you.
Here are those results. Thank you, everyone, for answering this question. It's always interesting to see what everyone says. Since we've been covering contracts and onboarding, I would like to direct your attention to the related content widget again, where you'll find our What to Include in Your Critical Vendor Contracts ebook. Greg, I'll pass it back to you.
Well, as we near the end of our webinar on onboarding, we just want to remind ourselves about the stages in first planning and risk assessment, which feeds into due diligence, which then informs your contracting. So while they all have their separate objectives, they're very much sequential and related. So where if the primary objectives are met, the following step is more successful. Don't think about these steps as being conducted in a vacuum. They're very much in a relationship that hopefully we impressed upon you today. Let's conclude today's session on vendor onboarding with some key takeaways. We talked about the business need and that request having the right details to ensure everyone's involved early on. Making sure you're doing the right amount of due diligence, the right effort of vetting should be conducted, which is risk-based. The risk assessment itself being detailed, very prescriptive to trigger and qualify and quantify the right risks for your organization and the industry that you're in. Contract best practices. Do not one-size-fits-all this steps. Look for using templates, but ensure that you're building additional provisions in, driven by risk and driven by due diligence results. Ensure those clauses are brought in as needed. Use subject matter experts. Not everyone can review all these due diligence evidence items that you are receiving. It's very hard to find one person that could do it all. Be flexible in due diligence, making sure you still maintain your key objectives, but think about alternative ways to fulfill the requirement. You're not always going to get everything that you need, everything you're requesting. And ultimately, make sure your contract protects your organization moving forward, allowing you to revisit due diligence as needed, allowing you to monitor performance and SLAs, and detailing effective terminations for when that process is needed. Back to you, Jesse.
Great. Thanks so much, Greg. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Greg for his time in sharing some really important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On March 23rd, our Beyond the Basics, Strategies to Mature Your Vendor Risk Management Program. And on March 30th, our Vendor Financial Red Flags Your Credit Union Should Watch For. We hope you will be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Greg, the next question is, do I need to vet every single vendor?
No, not every, but this shouldn't be subjective. Formally, there may be exceptions to the scope of your third-party risk management program. So refer to your policy there. For example, one-time services or low-dollar vendors may be what you consider. We've seen government agencies, regulatory bodies, as well as financial market infrastructures, FMIs, in that exclusions list. So with any governance materials, ensure this is transparent and any and all requesters, vendor owners have visibility and know your vetting scope. Thanks.
Great. Next question. When should the vetting process start?
Technically, vetting starts right away. The internal business or department that has identified the need for this product and service is vetting just by looking at who the options are and starting to consider reputation and public information discussed in this webinar. But the true interactive due diligence always follows risk assessment. So you can be specific in the vendor control areas you want or need to vet and assess.
Great. This next question goes right along with the last. How long should the vendor vetting process take?
Yeah, sure. Common question. It is hard to quantify. It's going to vary based on several factors here. So there's the availability of your own internal resources, the potential external support, outsourced due diligence, how quickly the vendor provides what is needed, and of course, how long it takes to review and make conclusions. So many variables there. You might target 6 to 12 weeks as a baseline window. I think it's most important to ensure that the business making the request and the business case are aware of these steps and aware of the timing and what's possible there. So consider if your organization can prioritize certain requests over others, if and when needed, based on the business needs and what's being requested.
Great. Next question. Does the board or senior leadership need to be involved in the vetting and/or onboarding process?
In general, yes. For example, if a new critical vendor is being onboarded, they may be involved in those approvals. But typically their involvement is as an informed party. For example, they may need to see due diligence results via regular reporting and also status, your own compliance to the third-party risk management policy or your overall program. So, I think that's the main target for the involvement. Thanks, Jesse.
Perfect. Our next question. Who should be involved in making sure appropriate terms are added to the contract based on the vetting or onboarding process?
Well, involvement is collaborative, certainly legal, whether that's inside or outside your organization. There's the SLAs, subject matter experts, as we talked about today, supporting due diligence. They may have specific recommendations. The vendor owner requester as well. The central third-party risk management team, if that's the structure of your program. I would definitely recommend setting up a RACI table for this, and of course all phases of the life cycle, but this ensures all parties involved know their role and responsibility, but especially, for contracting terms, really understanding who's going to contribute there.
Great. Thanks so much, Greg. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you, Greg, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. A big thank you to Greg for his time and great content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics such as vendor onboarding. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request a CPE credit. On behalf of VinMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.